acknowledge it. So the destruction of five full divisions of the Ethiopian National Defense Forces, that is a blow from which the National Army cannot recover. It cannot recover. It cannot be on the offensive in Tigray. The only thing left actually for the National Defense Forces is to negotiate its surrender or withdrawal from Tigray. That is the basic fact. It will not come back. There will be in the coming days, there are currently many thousands of prisoners of war. There will probably be several tens of thousands of prisoners of war. The equipment that was captured means that the Tigray Defense Forces is already deploying heavy artillery, anti-aircraft guns. It shot down a transport aircraft, military transport aircraft earlier today. This is a decisive turning point. Now, I'm sure you're all familiar with General Tzadkan. I was fortunate to be able to speak to him earlier today, and let me quote, he said, "I would be lying if I told you that I expected this result, but we worked day and night to achieve it." And what he was saying was that, yes, they applied all the skills that they had in military organization to rebuilding the army from scratch over the last 4 months, building upon the skills and the commitment of the Tigrayan officers and the Tigrayan people. They had many more recruits than they could properly train and handle. They were turning away most of the recruits who came. This, I think, was one of the major miscalculations made by Prime Minister Abiy and President Isaias, which is that if you commit atrocities against people, hoping to humiliate and degrade them, you may actually motivate them to fight. And in this case, this is what happened. And because this generation of leaders who had left politics and left the military some 20 years ago, whom nobody could say were members of the TPLF government over the last 20 years. They were in retirement or in their academic jobs or in business. Or in the case of Tzadkan, who was also trying to mediate to prevent the war from breaking out. They rejoined, they put their skills and experience to work, and we see the fruits of that now. They did not expect the Ethiopian National Defense Force to crumble as quickly as it has done. The question of when they take Mekelle is I don't know, but there is the capital is no longer credibly defensible by the forces that exist there. One reason why they may not want to take it is a fear of aerial bombardment. The government of Ethiopia has, as we know, shown that it is capable of doing what the Derg did some 30 years ago and bombing civilians. This leaves the question of Eritrea. The Eritrean Defense Force is more formidable. It is now matched, possibly outmatched by the Tigray Defense Force, but there is a major question about what the strategy of Isaias will be and the strategy of what Abiy will be. I think the events of the last week have demonstrated something that we all suspected for some time. Number one, that the Tigrayan resistance was undefeated and could not be defeated. And secondly, that the military imperial project that Prime Minister Abiy had embarked upon was doomed to failure. And it is now, that failure is becoming evident. And the question is now, with his electoral success and the fact that the votes that have been counted are votes for the Prosperity Party and for him, he now is in a position where his decisions, whether to continue with his existing project or whether to change tack, the right or wrong decisions are his to take, and he will be tested over the coming weeks. His first crisis, his first challenge as a newly elected prime minister will be to deal with the rout of his forces in Tigray. The equally important question that he will face will be Eritrea, because we face the challenge, which is actually that those who study the history of Ethiopia as an imperial entity will recognize this challenge, this historical fact, which is that the imperial ambitions of Ethiopian leaders in the 19th century, in the 20th century, Menelik, Haile Selassie, etc., were facilitated by external assistance, by guns provided by France and Britain, by support from the United States, and of course, in the case of the Derg, support from the Soviet Union. And as Yusuf was explaining earlier on, the external support in support of such an imperialist project now comes from this alliance of dictators, this axis of autocrats, that is Isaias. The project that Abiy, the military imperial project, is sustainable only if Isaias is fully committed to it, and the resources and capacity of the Eritreans, I think, are going to be are in the coming weeks tested to their limit. And the question is, will Isaias recognize this? Will he adopt a different strategy? Because as the Ethiopian military capacity crumbles, if the Eritrean military capacity is withdrawn, then Prime Minister Abiy has the challenge. Will he negotiate as an equal partner? Let me repeat that, as an equal partner with the leaders of the Tigray Defense Forces, because that will be his only option. The famine. The famine is a tragic, preventable, man-made famine. There are many reasons to criticize the years in which the EPRDF was in power. But on day one of the EPRDF assuming power back in May of 1991, the very first press conference at which the late Meles Zenawi spoke, he was asked by a journalist what was his ambition for his time in power. And he said, I hope that Ethiopians will eat 3 meals a day. And I think the achievement that cannot be taken away from the EPRDF was the conquest of famine in Ethiopia. 6 years ago, when there was a drought on a scale unprecedented in Ethiopian history, 20 million people needed emergency assistance. The EPRDF government mobilized assistance, mobilized its own resources. It paid for 70% of that relief program. So it was generous, it was expeditious, and it was extremely effective. It kept farmers on their land. And it meant that the greatest threat to food security in Africa at that time passed without any measurable increase in malnutrition and in deaths. If such a crisis were to strike Ethiopia today, the current government does not have that capacity, does not have the financial capacity, does not have the infrastructure, does not have the standing with the donors, and does not have, I suggest, the political will in order to do it. And it is sadly because of climate crisis, not a question of if, but a question of when. And we know from the history of famine in Ethiopia, of food crisis in other countries, that they bring down governments. The famine in Waal was one key factor that brought down Haile Selassie. The famine of 1984-85 was one key factor that brought down Mengistu. And it was precisely for this reason that if we read the National Security Doctrine white paper of 2002, produced by EPRDF, they identified as the #1 threat for national security, food security and poverty, not external threat. That was what they feared. And Ethiopia is in Tigray facing a man-made crisis of this nature. And any who think that that crisis will be confined to Tigray, they are deluding themselves. the black hole in the economy that is being created by the war in Tigray is sucking down the Ethiopian economy such that it is extremely vulnerable. This is looking ahead. How is the current crisis to be responded to? Because the tragic reality is that thousands of children will be suffering from starvation and most likely dying in the weeks and months ahead. The reality, the painful price of the current situation, including the escalation in the military confrontation, is that humanitarian relief will be interrupted. The war was not the major reason for the famine. The major reason was the starvation crimes perpetrated particularly by the Ethiopian, Eritrean forces and the Amhara militia. But as of now, with those forces confined to cities and in retreat, the major issue facing those who want to end the crisis of hunger, the major issue is humanitarian access. So what are the immediate options that face the Tigray Defense Forces as they move into a militarily dominant position with a population of between 3 and possibly 5 million people directly under their control in the coming weeks and months? Tigray is, of course, surrounded. There is the option, which will most likely be pursued by the governments in Addis Ababa and Asmara, of enforcing a blockade. How would that blockade be broken? It could be broken by military means. Personally, I would not advocate that. I think that would escalate the crisis. I think we need to look at other options. One option that I think would be worth looking at is the Operation Provide Comfort that was mobilized by the United States, Britain, and France to support the Kurdish regional authorities in the wake of the First Gulf War in 1991, when there was the Kurdish uprising against Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein tried to come back. The humanitarian crisis moved London, Paris, and Washington to do 3 things. First of all, mount a humanitarian airlift. Second, impose a no-fly zone. And third, recognize the de facto political authority of the Kurdish regional government, which then became a self-governing entity, not recognized by the world, but a functioning entity until such time as there was a change in government in Baghdad and the Kurdish regional authorities could participate in the democratic reconstruction of Iraq. Of course, that didn't go very smoothly, but you will understand the principle. The last point I want to make is the failure of the international community. The African Union has failed dismally, and it has failed insofar as it has not only failed to act, it has abrogated its own basic principles, which were adopted in the 1990s and early 2000s in the wake of Rwanda, Congo, Sierra Leone, Sudan, etc. Principles like sovereignty as responsibility, the norm of non-indifference, the requirement of offering and accepting good faith mediation efforts. These have been trampled upon. And precisely because the Africans have not stood up for those principles, the UN Security Council has been blocked. It is absolutely scandalous that after 7.5 months, the UN Security Council has not had a single session on this. People will say that this is because Russia and China are threatening their vetoes. Well, if the Africans were to back a resolution, China and Russia would defer to the Africans. This is the way they operate. And China is actually deeply disturbed about the instability in Ethiopia. It may not care about human rights. It does care about state disintegration and instability. Russia, much the same thing. So those of you who have leverage or ways of raising this issue in Africa, especially in Kenya. Kenya is the most important country, member of the Peace and Security Council, the United Nations Security Council, and of course a neighbor. Please do so, because while the Africans drag their feet, this will be a major obstacle to international action. Thank you very much. I will leave it at that.